we have come together for this book presentation of Professor Antony Macherry, a Jesuit who teaches here. And we are going to start with the welcoming address of the rector of this institute, Father David Nazar.
Welcome one and all to the Pontifical Oriental Institute, those here and those far away. Just a word about the Institute for those who might not know it. It was started, I think, with an extraordinary inspiration of the popes a little over 100 years ago. And it was an idea that was gestating from the time of Leo XIII in the late 1800s. And the idea was to create a center that could study the riches of the East. And it became one of the sort of defining phrases of the mission of the Orientali, to research the riches of the East and to make them available to the East and to the West. And that was the founding principle for the Orientali. And it was ecumenical before the word ecumenical was used. It was open to students, Catholic, Orthodox, all the other churches, as well as to students of the Latin Rite. So that's over 100 years ago. And it's significant because, as we know, the first churches were Oriental churches. The first liturgies were Oriental liturgies. The creeds were developed in Oriental countries. The first theologies were developed in Oriental countries. So the significance of having an institute that can concentrate on the study of the riches of the East is of great value for the universal church. And when we're talking about the riches, we're talking about languages. We're talking about cultures. We're talking even about politics, geography and history. All of that combines to form theology. And as we know, throughout history, humans have a habit of getting into conflicts. And sometimes the conflicts are from bad intentions, whether jealousy or fear or anger. And sometimes they happen by miscommunications. And the work that Antony Macherry has done is a perfect example of this. We're talking about a situation that draws from Syria, takes place in India, involves the Portuguese and Rome. So we're talking about countries and languages and history, and what one mind can understand all of that? What one person can guarantee the clarity of communication through all of that layered history and through the various languages? And that's the importance of Antony's work. It's a classical work expressing the mission of this institute, to study foundational documents with the dispassion that distance of time gives to you, and to look at where there were conflicts. What created these conflicts? Were they made by error or by human intention? And can we bring light to them? And the light that we bring to the past brings us light into the future. And that's, in great measure, what Antony Macherry's book has done. So welcome to this book presentation for all that it represents today and for future research. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Rector. Now we pass to the greetings. All of them have 4 to 5 minutes. So the first to speak is going to be Festo Lucas Mkende, a Jesuit. A Jesuit priest from Tanzania, Eastern Africa province, currently the academic director of ARSI, that is the Archivum Romanum Societatis Jesu. Father Mkende holds a D.Phil in history from the University of Oxford, specializing on African political history. Among his publications are Encounters Between Jesuits and Protestants in Africa, 2018, published by Brill. His forthcoming volume, Jesuits in Africa, a historical narrative from Ignatius of Loyola to Pedro Arrupe, again from Brill. So, Father Festo Lucas Mkende, please come and give us your greeting.
Thank you very much for a generous presentation, and thank you for this invitation for us to be here. Feel privileged that RC is well represented by myself and also by Dr. Camilla Russell, who is among us here and will soon hear from her. I feel particularly privileged to be here to witness the presentation of this very important book. I say it's very important even though I must confess that I have not read it, because I have learned that titles capture the content. And there's no doubt by looking at the title of the book, we get to know the importance of the content of the current book. But also I say this with a lot of confidence, because I have read glowing reviews of Father Antony Macherry's previous book, Testing Ground for Jesuit Accommodation in Early Modern India, which was published by the Institutum Historicum Societatis Jesu, which is the publications branch of RC. And so in a way, I feel that Father Antony Macherry has really been an embodiment of what RC is all about. We are entrusted with a threefold mission to preserve historical documents, some of which are 5 centuries old, but also to make those documents available to researchers. And Father Macherry has been one of the people who really come to us and have put the resources we preserve into very good use. And for that, we are very grateful. But also, we have another mission. We are involved in publications and in research. And so, Father Macherry's previous book was actually published by us. And I hope we'll have more people not only coming to research with us, but also to think about publishing with us. In that sense, he has used our resources, what we preserve. He has also published with us. And in a way, we are proud to keep his books with us. We are now preservers of his publications, and we hope that 5 generations or 5 centuries to come, other generations of researchers will find his publications well preserved at RC. Congratulations, Father, for this publication, and thank you for inviting us. Thank you for making sure that RC is here to witness what you have done with the sources that you have used from us. Thank you.
Father Festo, thank you very much, especially for keeping the time limit. Okay, now I present Professor George A. Kiraz, who is going to greet us too. He is the Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, Director of Beth Marduta, Editor-in-Chief of Gorgeous Press, where the book has been published. He usually works on the Syriac language and the digital humanities. So, Father Professor Kiraz?
Will be online?
Online, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Many thanks to the Pontifical Orientale Institute for the invitation to join today's event. I am delighted to be here, virtually of course. I am hearing some voices that I recognize, and I wish I can be with you. But I am here in my role as Editor-in-Chief of Gorgias Press, which has recently published the book by Antony Macherry that we're here to celebrate today. For those who may not be familiar with Gorgias, my wife, Christine, and I founded the press back in 2001. In a way, we just celebrated our 20th anniversary. Gorgias Press is an independent publisher of peer-reviewed titles on the history, religion, and linguistics of the Middle East and larger pre-modern world. Following the philosophy publishing for the sake of knowledge, the press is run for scholars by scholars and distinguishes itself through the publication of rare and understudied topics alongside more mainstream works. Gorgias Press has become well known for its pioneering publications in the fields of linguistics, religion, and particularly Syriac studies and Eastern Christianity. In fact, back in 2001, when my wife Christine and I founded the press, our first publication was titled India in 1500 AD, The Narratives of Joseph the Indian by another Antony, not this Antony, but another Antony Balafantara. It is therefore particularly rewarding to be here today and to see the relationship between Gorgias Press publications and the St. Thomas Christians continuing for over 20 years. Those attending today will be particularly interested in our Eastern Christian Studies series, of which Antony's work is published on a Latin-Syriac Treatise from Early Modern Malabar. I will leave Antony, of course, to tell you more about his work in detail, and I look forward to hearing all of today's speakers' reflections on the challenges of evangelization in early modern Syriac India. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me again.
Thank you very much, Professor Kiraz. I've known you thus far through your publications. Now you are no longer a mystery. Now I've seen you face to face. Okay, so now we have a third speaker who is going to greet the assembly here, and that is Dr. Camilla Russell. Camilla Russell is publications editor, Institutum Historicum Societatis Jesu, including the journal Archivum Historicum Societatis Jesu at Ars. Trained in the United Kingdom, Italy, and Australia. The author of numerous studies in Jesuit history and the religious and cultural history of Renaissance and early modern Italy and the wider world. The author of 2 monographs, Giulia Gonzaga and the Religious Controversies of 16th Century Italy, Prepulse 2006, and published this month, Being a Jesuit in Renaissance Italy, Biographical Writing in the Early Global Age, Harvard University Press, 2022. So, Dr. Camilla, I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Father, and thank you for the warm welcome, as well as to the director and to the rector, and also to the author, Father Macherry, for inviting me here. I will be speaking in some ways about the context, very briefly, about the context for the work that you'll be hearing more about, by way of the publication for which I was responsible as editor by Father Antony Macherry, and this is a copy of the book. And I permit myself to do that, as you will hear, because it does provide the context for the work we're going to be hearing about. In this 2020 work, The Testing Ground for Jesuit Accommodation in Early Modern India, Antony Macherry explores the underlying dynamics of the accommodation experiments led by Francisco Ros S.I, a Catalonian from the Jesuit province of Aragon, in the cultural and religious terrain of Malabar, where he worked principally among the region's Christian communities. Macherry's historical analysis becomes an interpretive key to understanding the later mission launched by Roberto de Nobili, S.J., and the main proponent of accommodation in the non-Christian context of Madurai in South India. Most importantly, the study underscores the Jesuit mission in early modern India as the crucial intersecting point for some of the most prominent promoters of accommodation in the first century of the Society of Jesus, especially Alessandro Valignano, who many of you will have heard of, and Matteo Ricci, famous missionaries in Asia. The micro-historical approach taken in this study concerning the encounter of the Jesuit missionaries with the St. Thomas Christians in India as Father Macherry tells us, sheds light on the specific role of the mission context of Malabar. And through this micro-historical approach, we have one particular person that emerges as holding a pivotal role, Archbishop Francisco Ros. And what I think is key is something that the reviewers picked up. But before I quote them, I just want to mention, in terms of the context of our publications at Institutum Historicum Societatis Jesu, the testing ground for Jesuit accommodation is the 79th volume in the series Bibliotheca Instituti Historici Societatis Jesu. Established in 1941, the Bibliotheca series is devoted to monographs and edited essay collections on the history and culture of the Society of Jesus. This volume really aligns well with the mission entrusted to IHSI publications by the late Father General Adolfo Nicolas to publish works about and by regions and scholars from underrepresented spheres of Jesuit history, especially Asia and Africa, and of course with an emphasis on excellence. And Father Macherry is certainly, his work is an example of true scholarly excellence. We were thrilled to have the opportunity to work with Father Macherry on this project, aligning also very well with a further specific request of Father General Sousa to promote the academic discipline of history among young Jesuits worldwide. And I think we have a fine example of that here in this book. In terms of the quality of the book, we have the reviewer, one of the reviewers of this work, Francis Xavier Clooney, SJ, identified Father Macherry as, quote, a rising scholar who promises to be for decades to come one of the leading historians of the Society of Jesus in India. He wrote, impressively detailed scholarship underlies the book, a mastery of sources in the required Western and Indian languages, including archival materials, letters and texts that have never been printed. It is a paradigm of meticulous scholarship. The book makes a fresh contribution to familiar and much discussed issues with respect to Christianity in Asia. And I'll just name one of those to conclude. Clooney writes, as Macherry sees it, it makes sense to see the mission to non-Christians of South India as extending the accommodation exercised with respect to the Malabar Christians. So in another review, I might rephrase that as well, another review by Herman Teule in the Journal of Hindu Christian Studies wrote, at the heart of Macherry's discussion is the figure of Francisco Ros, whose policy and practice of accommodation was largely of his own devising. In brief, whereas for the Jesuit missionaries who preceded Ros in India, accommodation meant merely a nominal acceptance of the traditions they encountered, Ros's program sought to fully engage and, as far as possible, maintain them. So as Macherry observes, the reviewer writes, this approach recalled the Pauline understanding of mission, which called on missionaries to embrace accommodation to the satisfaction of everyone, all players, and in doing so, sought to appropriate the apparent barriers in a mission and employ them as tools that facilitate conversion. So this is a really interesting series of themes, and I, for one, can testify to the fact that I learned a great deal about the subtleties and complexities of accommodation, but also of its fruits for historians and for us now in trying to explore questions of mission. So thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry I might have run over time, but congratulations to Father Macherry for the publication of this book we're about to hear about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Camilla Russell, for this informative presentation. Now, I ask Professor Istvan Perczel to greet the assembly, to give a talk now. It's different. We are now have entered into the era of speakers. So he's going to talk about a blonde Thomas, Francisco Ros's evolution from inquisitor to representative of native Christianity. And here is my presentation of Professor Perczel, professor in the Department of Medieval Studies at Central European University, Vienna. His research fields late antique, patristic philosophy, Christian Platonism, and Byzantine theology. His latest publications include an edited volume, Christian Historiography Between Empires, 4th to 8th centuries, and the study Notes on the Earliest Greco-Syriac Reception of the Dionysian Corpus in the Oxford Handbook of Dionysius the Areopagite, both 2021. In the year 2000, he initiated the digitization and cataloging of the manuscript collections of the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala, resulting in the collection of digital images of over 1,200 paper manuscripts written in Syriac and Garshuni Malayalam, and around 60,000 palm leaf manuscripts, archived now at Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, undergoing their cataloging process. Currently, he is working on Garshuni Malayalam texts digitized during the project. So, Professor Perczel.
I understand that the time limits are strict, so I will not read my paper that I have written for this, because I want to present images. First I would like to say why I am so happy with the two books of Father Antony Macherry, because they are propounding a radical change in the understanding of a person whom I didn't know when I went to India to initiate the digitization, because it was done by a large team. So to initiate it, I have barely heard about Francisco Ros. And then, during the digitization, we encountered texts. Texts which were mostly, with one exception, anonymous. But they were showing, and these texts were written in Syriac and in Malayalam. And they were showing the hand of a very curious personality. And such things as a translation of the mystical theology of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. And at the beginning I didn't know what this is. I thought perhaps this is a lost translation from the Middle Ages attributed to Athanasius Ballad. Then I showed it to our greatest teacher, Sebastian Brock, and he said, this is from the Latin. And he showed me that it was translated from Ambrogio Traversari's Latin translation and not from the Greek. And then we were speculating with Malfono, Sebastian Brock, what could it be? And he was proposing some Middle Eastern Chaldean authors. And finally I realized that the author was Francisco Ros, who was translating Latin texts into Syriac for the use of his Indian faithful. And then we encountered a Malayalam text written in Garshuni script, very strange. I learned the Garshuni and tried to understand, and I found, for example, the Acts of Thomas in Malayalam, and tried to understand what this can be. But easily one understood that the translation of the Acts of Thomas were made on the basis of a Latin text and a Syriac text into Malayalam with a lot of Syriac embedded texts. And finally, studying those historical issues, I came to the conclusion, I don't know it yet, that most probably the author is Francisco Ros. And so on and so on. So I would like to give a presentation. those historical events that I am citing here, you will find in much more detail in Father Macherry's 2 books. But it is good to remind us of this. So the last Chaldean metropolitan ruling the St. Thomas Christians in the 16th century, before Francisco Ruz somehow, and one must say forcibly, took it over, was Mar Abraham. The history of Mar Abraham, in a nutshell, is presented in the first book of Father Antony Macherry. Here I am reminding only some events. It was in 1580, January, that Mar Abraham, who was a Chaldean metropolitan, finally sent there by Rome. Earlier he was an Nestorian and complicated history. He accepted the Roman usage of the sacraments, including the use of the extreme unction and the communion under one species, as well as the celebration of the Roman feast days. He proposed to impose upon his flock the usage of the Roman Missal and the Roman breviary under the strict condition that they be translated and printed in Syriac, possibly also in Malayalam transcription, so as to make them easier to use. He explains at length why Syriac had to be maintained, because Syriac was of great antiquity, and because the Church speaks in several languages, while the faith and the baptism are one and the same. Yet, as it can be judged on the basis of a good amount of Syriac manuscripts linked to Mar Abraham, his intention seems to have been to follow publicly the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar, but to continue to use the traditional prayers and liturgical books, and to preserve the jurisdictional ties with the Chaldean Patriarchate of Mesopotamia. For this later, he was very severely accused by Francisco Ruz. In the same year, this is an error. So there was a synod in Angamali in 1583 when the thorough Latin canon of the Church was imposed upon the Church. It was convoked by Alessandro Valignano and by Mar Abraham. 1 year later, sorry for the error here, in 1584, a young, 25 years old Catalonian Jesuit, who was called there Francisco Ruz, but whose original name was Francesc Ros. This is why we have this ambiguity about writing the name with Z or S, arrived in Kerala. And he proved very early a linguistic genius who learned Syriac in Father Macherry. Was it in 6 months that he learned Syriac? No, I think I found the reason why he could learn Syriac so quickly. Because he came knowing very good Hebrew and Aramaic. He studied in Valencia, and later a book that we identified as being of Francisco Ruz, everything is anonymous. And why is everything anonymous? Because he was a very humble, very modest person. There is something very attractive in the personality, although the personality has many contradictory elements, as is very beautifully shown by Father Antony. In 1585, the Third Provincial Council of Goa was held under the presidency of the Archbishop of Goa. Mar Abraham received a safe conduct and participated, although normally he was hiding from the Portuguese. And they obliged Mar Abraham to repeat his confession of faith that he made in Rome first and second in 1576. But the 8th decree appointed an assistant to the Archbishop of Malabar, who should be a religious and learned person with authority, whose help Mar Abraham would need So I'm quoting, because of his old age, illnesses, and because he is less well versed in the affairs of the Latin than in those of the Chaldean Church, so that it is natural that he should be assisted by this religious person to execute all the decisions of the council. Mar Abraham first refused to sign those decrees because he felt they were very much impeding upon his authority as a Chaldean metropolitan. But under the threat of the Inquisition, he recanted, signed, and promised to act accordingly. And the assistant assigned to him was Francisco Ros. And I would say the assistant was a supervisor. And interestingly, in one of the manuscripts, we found those decrees translated into Syriac. And how to say, I cannot prove it, but as I feel, I already know the style of Ros when translating, I think the translator was Ros. Basically, he was acting for everything that needed Syriac. There were two other Jesuits who knew Syriac, but none of them as much as he did. Here is the translation in that manuscript. The translation style of Ros is that he doesn't translate. He rewrites, and whatever is legalistic, Latin, whatever, becomes patristic, biblical, and spiritual. In his quality of how to say, assisting Mar Abraham, he had access to the manuscripts of Mar Abraham and of the community in general. It is written in one of the histories, Syriac histories of the church, which were written in those times, that Mar Abraham came to Malabar bringing many books, which indicates that not all, but a good number of the books which later were condemned at the famous Synod of Dietmar in 1599 were personal books of Mar Abraham. Somehow Francisco Ros had access to those books, and then little later than this Goan provincial council, he compiled the manuscript, which he later sent to Rome, which was discovered in the archives and edited by Father Antony, and which we are celebrating now. It's a great discovery. I didn't ever hear about it. I knew only something else, the later manuscript, the later text, which was published by Irene Ozer. Now, these, in these writings, the first one, written in, if I remember well, in 1586, and the second, 1587, are accusing the Mar Abraham, basically, of teaching heresy under the guise of obedience to the Roman See. And normally, how to say, now we like to disculpate Mar Abraham, and I would certainly disculpate him. But one has to admit, however, that whatever accusation Ros brought up against Mar Abraham, and this is something very tough, really very tough, and this is why I am calling him, and I know that Father Antony does not agree with me, a kind of inquisitor in his first stage of activity in Malabar. But with one thing we cannot accuse him. He was not distorting anything. He was perhaps not right in the interpretation, but the facts are proven by the Syriac manuscripts that we found in Malabar. Here is one such Syriac manuscript, a Kashkor, Book of the Ordinary Prayers, copied in 1585 that is to say, the year of the Goan Synod. Even before the Goan Synod, Mar Abraham several times promised to correct the books. This is a fantastic, beautiful Nestorian manuscript copied in India, in Kotamangalam, by a close associate of Mar Abraham. It follows the order of the monastery of Mar Gabriel, crowned the friend of the angels, at the shore of the Tigris River above Mosul. And the colophon, written in 1585, commemorates Mar Abraham and the Chaldean patriarch as being the unique head of the church, with expressions which were explicitly condemned by Ros. So he was not wrong. I don't think that there was a dogmatic issue here. What Mar Abraham thought, and this is clear from some of his writings, is that the two confessions did not differ so much, and that he had no real reason for changing the ancient tradition of his church. He had no problem with accepting the Roman authority, but he had very serious problem in thinking that his church was heretic. So, for this reason, he promised to change, but did not change. He rose because of his linguistic genius. He was acting as the main Syriacist of the Europeans. There are those two treatises. I am not dwelling on them because Father Antony has really presented them beautifully. And Ros became professor of Syriac at the Vajpikota Jesuit Seminary. He was very much arguing about another Jesuit who also knew Syriac, Antonio Toscano, for the necessary usage of Syriac. And he convinced, as this is also presented in Father Macherry's books, he convinced the Jesuit mission to switch to Syriac, as far as they were able to, because they didn't have very many Syriacists. For this reason, his activity as professor of Syriac was very important, because he also had a very grandiose view about the future of the Indian church. He wanted to educate a local clergy, and he was also for appointing a local bishop. The Archdeacon George of the Cross, whom the Jesuits proposed in 1584 to be appointed Bishop of Pala. But it has never been realized. And interestingly, Ros writes that this is because of the objection of Mar Abraham, who thought that an Indian would not be appropriate to be appointed, because the Indians are very proud. Which, in fact, they are, I must admit. But it's not necessarily a problem. Father Macherry, in his second book, gives a very interesting table in which he traces the history of the accusations against Mar Abraham and apparently the fate of the people, because there was no other fate there in India. But Ros thought that they were hijacked by these Middle Eastern missionaries, and they were fundamentally an ancient Christianity, the See of St. Thomas, and he thought that the Jesuit mission should restore the original Catholic faith of them. This is problematic in our view now, but this was the best sympathetic approach that could exist then after the Council of Trent. We have to understand that he was a Tridentine Christian, and the Council of Trent was a counter-Reformation council, and enforced a kind of dogmatism that was not even there before the council in the Catholic Church. So in April 1596, the Goan Inquisition conducted a secret inquiry into the crypto-Nestorian heresy of Mar Abraham at the Vaipikota seminary and found him guilty. And there were 3 witnesses, because we need 3 witnesses. Antonio Toscano first, Francisco Ruz second, and Jorge de Castro third. But in fact, there was only 1 witness, because Antonio Toscano and Jorge de Castro only testified to information that they received from Ros. He was the only one who knew the issue, but they needed 3 witnesses. This resulted in the condemnation of Mar Abraham, but soon Mar Abraham died. Reading those proceedings is not how to say, not a funny thing. You feel that this is very tough. And this is why I call Ros, in his first phase, in the first phase of his activity, an inquisitor, although he was not part of the Inquisition, but he was the main actor. It seems, and this is what I think Father Antony's books are suggesting, that there was a turning point when basically his accusatory activity, Ros's accusatory activity, finally bore fruits at the Synod of Diamper. And it seems that at that moment he understood that, perhaps he understood it earlier, but still he was acting at the Synod of Diamper, but then he understood that something was not going well. And then he changed course. I believe that he earlier had qualms about this, but he was cooperating with the principal instigator of the Synod of Diamper, Aleixo de Menezes, before turning against him. According to Antonio Gouveia, before the opening of the Synod, Archbishop Aleixo de Menezes had written the Acts of the Synod in the fort of Kranganur and invited Malabari priests of the Latin Rite to translate them under the supervision of Ros. However, we read it otherwise in the introduction to the Acts of the Synod of Diamper. According to it, the translation was done by a certain priest Jacob, vicar of the church at Palurutti, together with Ros and Antonio Toscano. The Acts were produced in 2 scripts, Malayama, probably on palm leaves, and Garshuni Malayalam, which is a mixed script of Syriac and Malayama characters. That's a southern script, Dravidian script. And we were extremely lucky, thanks to the great historian Matthias Mundadan, to find and digitize, I think, the original text of the Acts of Diamper in Garshuni Malayalam script. And Matthias Mundadan found the manuscript and deposed it at the Dharmaram College in Bangalore, and they permitted us the digitization. What we see here is that not only these Malayalam Acts do not correspond precisely to the Portuguese texts published in 1604 in Coimbra, but they don't correspond either to the Malayalam texts which were published by Skaria Zakaria on the basis of manuscripts found in India. The text is much shorter. Even the most of the proceedings of the first day, which are very important in the Portuguese text, are missing. Why? Because those things did not happen. What happened, in fact, was that Aleixo de Menezes, the Augustinian friar who was the bishop of Goa, was acting high-handedly. And he pushed through the condemnatory texts of the synod. Portuguese soldiers were there. They obliged the Christians to sign. All this is presented in the first book of Father Antony. But even this was not enough for creating the image of the submission, so-called reduction, of the Indian church as Aleixo Menezes felt was needed in Portugal. So he recreated, and what we read as the acts of the Dianthal Synod are something that has never happened in that form, and that's something that has never been signed, even under duress. Some part, yes, and many of them not. And I think this is due to the testimony of this text. I don't say it's the original text, it's a copy, but it is certainly the closest to the original text. Okay. Oh, this is not so important. What is important, because I have little time left, what is important is, however, that at that time Francisco Ros was collaborating with Aleixo de Menezes. The big issue was to convince the main representative of the St. Thomas Christians, Archdeacon George of Christ, to obey. And he didn't want to. And later, I learned it from Father Antony's first book, that later Ros himself wrote that were it not for his activity of convincing the archdeacon to obey, that would have never happened. Now, there is another discovery, a letter, again anonymous, but very clearly distinguishable style of Francisco Ros with exquisite Syriac that nobody else among the missionaries knew at that time, which shows what kind of person he was, what kind of diplomacy he had, and how he could convince the archdeacon, who was very reluctant to obey, and this is clear from the letter as well. A letter was written earlier in 1597, after the death of Mar Abraham. So what kind of diplomacy he was exerting still in that period, which I still think was his inquisitorial period. I greet your holy soul and kiss the footstool of your honorable preeminence. This is how he is speaking to the head of the Indian church. And am venerating your righteous lordship. And after greeting you, I disclose to you my desire to meet you and to serve you. For I have written and sent letters to you, but you have not responded to me a single word, although I glorified you and made a praise of you to so-and-so of Goa. So-and-so, because these were transmitted for teaching letter writing, not as historical documents, so the names were removed. But this is clearly Aleixo de Menezes. He very much rejoiced because of you, but he was grieved because of the demise of the Metropolitan of Angamali. There is no, how to say, opposition, conflict here, because everything should go diplomatically. And he wants to help you. He went to the north in a haste. And this is the cause. Yes, I will finish. Okay. And this is the cause why he did not write and send you any letter, only he was rejoicing even before through the intermediary of your servant. He will come back from the north, and then he will send to you and honor you as it befits your magnificence. Now he sends to you many kisses. Nevertheless, let there not be any little-mindedness in you due to the fact that no letter has arrived from the Lord Pope to so-and-so and you. The one who took your letters from here to Rome has not arrived this year, but would arrive beyond doubt, now in September. I am not reading the whole thing, just to show that this was his diplomacy. And this is how he could convince, even though he was then faithfully serving Menezes. I skip the story of how to say, Ros's revolt against Menezes. I only say that after all this story, after the condemnation of the books, he understood that a new literature should be given to those Christians. You cannot simply take away something and not to give. That literature had to be in Syriac and Malayalam. And he, and also some people in his entourage, were capable to create this literature. And we have also the well-known, the liturgical texts, but we have apocryphal educative literature from Latin Apocrypha. We have scriptural commentaries on the books of Genesis, the Psalms, the Song of Songs, by Dionysius the Carthusian, who is called in those books Mard Dionysius the Interpreter. We have that Indian Syriac version of the mystical theology, a Syriac translation of the treatise of Pedro Gomez on the seven sacraments, and a number of original creations. And the most fantastic is this one, the first early modern dialogue of interfaith dialogue between a Jewish rabbi, a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, and a Hindu. We are editing and translating it now. And he was working together with Indian priests, and this is my last item, with Indian priests, his pupils at the Vaipikota Seminary, among whom the most outstanding was Kadavil Chandi Kattanar, who called himself Alexandros Lemenaya, or Alexander the Indian, Alexander of the Port, who was writing after the death of Ros a panegyric. And it is from this panegyric that we know that Ros was blonde. And he calls him a blonde Thomas, a renewer. Now, here I stop, and I want to say that unfortunately the successors of Ros were of much lesser caliber. They did not know Syriac. This absence of racism, which is very clear in Ros, was absent from them. They appointed Syriac teachers at the Vaipikota Seminary who knew Syriac less than some of their pupils. Kadavil Chandi was not given any position. Finally, he participated in the revolt against the Jesuit archbishops. And that grandiose project of Ros was realized only in the sense that all those books were faithfully transmitted and copied in India, together with Nestorian books, with Chaldean books. There was a big mixture, then with Jacobite books. All that was Syriac was welcome. And a very interesting hybrid culture was created in which the creations of Ros played a very important part. This was not his objective, but it was his achievement, however. Thank you, and sorry if I was too long.
Thank you very much, Professor Perczel. We know that your presentation presents an invitation to ask questions, which we will have, however, at the end of all four presentations, so that we will not be lost somewhere on the way. Thank you very much. Now, I wish to introduce Professor Herman Teule, who is going to talk about Syriac India. What did it mean in the early modern period? Professor Teule is Professor Emeritus of Oriental Christian Studies at the Universities of Leuven and Nijmegen. His academic work is focused on the Christian-Muslim interaction in the period of the so-called Syriac Renaissance and on the impact of Latin missionaries on the theological developments of Syriac-speaking Christians, in which he has made several notable contributions to his field. He actually leads a project of developing a tool for the study of Christian Arabic. So, Professor Teule.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the intriguing points of the report by Francisco Ros on the errors of the East Syrians, now edited by Father Macherry, is that the text contains a number of substantial Syriac quotations, to the extent even that Father Macherry speaks of a Syriac Latin treatise. This, of course, does not mean that the treatise is really bilingual. The Syriac fragments are quotations from various Syriac sources, and they are used as proof text to demonstrate their presumed Nestorian heresy. And this, of course, raises a set of questions. What did Ros and the other missionaries know about the exposure of St. Thomas Christians to Syriac theology and liturgy? And did the information they had reflect the real situation? Was it accurate or partial or even selective? And where did they get their information from? Observation, context, informants? And in the case of Ros, this question is not so easy to answer. In his first report, so that's the one edited by Macherry, Ros says that he used furtim, secretly, and I'm a bit puzzled with this word. Why furtim? That he had used their public works, that are liturgical texts, but that he did not have had access to their private books, except those that had been shown to him by the Archbishop in Goa. I come to him later. In the second report, which was edited by Ireneo Serra, and that was written a year later, he is hardly more precise and speaks of Libri Syriaci, Syriac books, which are in many cases liturgical works, which he seems to have studied in a very careful way. He mentions a small Syriac book, Libellum, written by some Nestorian, he says, which on the basis of a quotation in the Acts of the Synod of the Amper can be identified as John Bar Khaldun. He further mentions an old, uninstructed priest as informant, and refers to a creed of Mar Audisho, who was the second patriarch of the recently founded Chaldean church. And then finally, he refers to the book of Parisman. It is a book of spells, a popular genre among the East Syrian Christians of Mesopotamia, and which apparently was also used in Kerala. The anonymous bishop, archbishop of the first report, is in the second report mentioned by his name. It is Mar Avraham. We heard about him a lot in the previous talk, the later Archbishop of Angamali, who coming from Mesopotamia had settled in India in or a little bit before 1556. And Avraham was a very colorful prelate. He had come to India as a bishop of the Church of the East, but later moved on to the faction united with Rome, the newly established Chaldean church. And this event, Avraham, traveling to India, firstly as an envoy of the Nestorian patriarch, raises another set of questions basically the awareness of, let's say, India among the East Syrian Christians in Mesopotamia in the second half of the 16th century. Why did he go there? And to what extent were the St. Thomas Christians still a living reality in the mind of their Mesopotamian brothers? And I would like to begin my talk with this latter point, which we could call India in Mesopotamia, India as a still living reality in the minds of the Mesopotamian Christians, but it is only a stepping stone to my second part, Mesopotamia in India, Syriac Christianity in India. What did it really mean? India, Mesopotamia. So there are quite a number of texts, juridical and other, highlighting the age-long relationship between the Church of the East and Kerala. It is very much understandable that because of the very extreme, difficult political situation in the 15th century in Mesopotamia, this relationship was dormant. In Mesopotamia, surviving was the main issue, and India seemed only a distant reality, not only geographically, but also mentally. At least, we are not well informed how in this period the Patriarch and his synod viewed this relationship. This changed, however, by the end of the 15th century, when, as we can read in a famous historical short notice called Sharba in Syriac, which was written down in 1533, that 3 Christian believers from the faraway lands of India took the initiative to ask the Catholicos, the Patriarch, to ordain bishops for their lands. That happened in 1490. And these Kerala Christians even made a long journey to Mesopotamia. 3 of them, 1 died on their way, where the Catholicos, seeing their level of instruction, ordained them priests and sent them back in the company of no less than 2 bishops, duly ordained, taken from the monks living in a monastery, in the famous monastery of Mar Augin. And a little bit later, his successor, the new Catholicos, even ordained 3 more bishops for India. The impression one gets from this Sharba, this notice, is that this visit from India was considered as something natural, but also that steps had to be taken to restore the solid relationship of the previous times. And the good contacts now re-established continued because 15 years later, again a new Catholicos received an interesting letter describing the situation of the Christians in India. Anyhow, one of the first bishops, Mar Yohanan, remained in office as long as till the year 1552 when he died. This renewed and seemingly solid Nestorian Indian relationship may explain, according to me, that India was almost immediately put on the agenda of the leaders of the new Chaldean church, when with John Sulaka, a rival East Syriac church was founded, now in communion with Rome. Already in 1553, so 2 years after the creation of the Chaldean church, the newly consecrated Patriarch Audicio IV, succeeding to John Sulaka, immediately dispatched 2 bishops, Chaldean bishops, to India. And one of these was Elia Asmar, one of the 5 bishops ordained by John Sulaka himself after his return from Rome. And he should act as the representative of the Patriarch. The second Chaldean bishop was Joseph Sulaka, no one else than John Sulaka's brother, who should become the leader of the Chaldean Christians in India. So it is clear the beginning Chaldean church had to establish herself, affirm herself against the Nestorian patriarch, which was a struggle which apparently and significantly had not only to be fought out in the Diyarbakir and the Mosul region, so in the Middle East, but also in India. And in the papal bull recognizing John Sulaka as the patriarch of India, of Mosul, it is explicitly mentioned that he also had authority over the Christians in Masin, in Calicut, and Auctore, India, in whole India. We know of the tragic fate of Joseph Sulaka, whose allegiance to Rome was not recognized by the Portuguese in India, despite the fact that he was accompanied by two Dominicans, Ambrogio Butibek and a Father Sahara. And I consider the presence of these two Dominicans as an indication that establishing a Chaldean hierarchy in India was not only a priority in the eyes of the Chaldean leadership, but also for Rome a way of countering the Nestorian presence in Kerala. As one can imagine, the Nestorian Mother Church too continued to reach out to India. After the death of one of the first bishops, Mar Yohanan, a new prelate arrived there, the person of Mar Abraham just mentioned and also in the previous conference. He arrived there in or before 1556, so a little bit before the Chaldean Joseph Sulaka. The Portuguese accused him already 1 year later of heresy and forced him to abandon his church and to convert to Catholicism. And later, we interestingly see him as someone who seems to have recognized the authority of the Chaldean patriarch, who seized this opportunity and recognized him as the metropolitan for India. Meaning that in this way, the Chaldean church, with two bishops in India, tried to extend its influence, so the Latin missionaries had mixed feelings about these Oriental prelates and continued to consider them as heretics. And it is this Mar Abraham who is one of the informants of Father Ros. Now my second part, Syriac in India. All these bishops traveling to India did not go there empty-handed, but carried with them books that apparently they deemed important for their missions. This is certainly true of Mar Yaqub, one of the three bishops arriving in India as early as 1504, and of Mar Abraham himself. And once in India, they also promoted the copying of new manuscripts by local people. This means that in the 16th century, there was an influx of new Syriac literature into India, additional to the Syriac books that were already there. One of the problems of assessing the exposure to Syriac culture and theology by the St. Thomas Christians, one of the difficulties is, of course, that the Synod of Dietmar had ordered the destruction of all Syriac books except the liturgical and the biblical ones. These latter had only to be purged from presumed errors according to a procedure that was also applied in the case of the Maronites and the Chaldeans. The reason, of course, was practical. Theoretically, those books should be destroyed, but this would have implied that no liturgical books had been available. So better amending or correcting them and allowing them to be used. To understand Francisco Ros, the question is important. Which Syriac books were circulating in Kerala? And is it possible to determine the character of Syriac culture and of Syriac literature that he deemed heretical? The first most precious testimony to this is, of course, the famous or infamous list of Syriac books denounced by the Synod of the Yamper, which goes back, partly goes back, to the reports by Francis Ros. This list is a strange mixture of serious theological writings, apocryphal and liturgical texts, and what we could label para-theological texts. According to an interpretation put forward by Françoise Briquel-Châtonnet, this list would be rather theoretical and aimed at including all literary genres used by the Nestorians. Should therefore be seen as a general condemnation of Nestorianism and not to be taken as a source for what was really found in the Kerala libraries, private or public. According to me, this interpretation is ignoring the fact, as I just mentioned, the previous period was characterized by an influx of books brought to India by the various bishops traveling from Mesopotamia, and that Ros, as one of the architects of the Yamper, was interested in specific works circulating in Kerala. Interesting in this respect is that the book of Parisman, a book of spells and curses, is said in the text of the Yamper to be most popular with the local priests. Apparently, such a work was widely spread exactly as it is the case or was the case in Mesopotamia. For other works mentioned by the Yamper, it is a bit more difficult to say. Such another work mentioned in the Yamper text is the Margarita Fidei, as the Synod says, without mentioning the author. This is the Octava de Margarita, the Book of the Pearl, written by the 13th century great bishop and scholar Abdisio Barbrija. This is a summary of the Nestorian Creed, and judging from the number of manuscripts, it was most popular reading in the 15th and 16th century. If it was not already there in India, one can easily imagine that it was brought to Kerala by one of the traveling bishops because it presents the Nestorian Creed in a very concise and compact and also didactic way. And interestingly, the description of this work by the Yamper Synod is pretty accurate and shows that Ros or others had thoroughly studied it. Well, yesterday we had here the public defense of a doctoral thesis on the book of Varda. Well, that interestingly, that is also one of the books mentioned and condemned by this Synod of the Yamper. Well, I'm coming to a conclusion. So many, many more books are being described. When we look at this list of theological writings, it looks as if the great majority of these were composed in the period of the Syriac Renaissance, in the period of the 13th and 14th century. And this leads support to the hypothesis that these works, written and recopied not so long before the Yamper Synod, reached Ros through the 16th century bishops traveling to India, especially, of course, Mar Abraham. Since, as I suggested in my introduction, in the previous centuries were not propitious for exporting books and entertaining relations with India. Consequently, these works cannot be considered as representative of the theological thinking or of the theological mindset of the Kerala Christians. The situation, of course, is different with the liturgical books, where Ros struggled against an in Kerala already extant tradition, as was also the case with the Book of Parisman, which, according to the Dietmar Synod, was frequently found in the houses of priests and deacons. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Teule. I found your talk to be brimming full of information, well presented. However, on one very minor point, when you named those two Maltese bishops, Maltese being my native tongue and being also a Semitic tongue, the correct pronunciation is Buttigieg and Zara. I'll forgive you. Okay, now I have to I present Professor Dr. Dietmar Winkler, who is certainly very well known to a wide public. Dietmar Winkler is Professor of Patristic Studies and History of Christianity at the University of Salzburg and is founding director of the University Center for the Study of the Christian East. Specialized in the ancient religious and cultural heritage of the Middle East, he is responsible for the unofficial dialogues with Syriac and Oriental Orthodox Christianity within the Pro-Oriente Foundation. He is consultant at the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity at the Vatican and a member of the official Roman Catholic Oriental Orthodox Dialogue. So I leave the word to Professor Dietmar Winkler.
Thank you very much. Could you please show the PowerPoint presentation? I hope you still have stamina, so because the oxygen is getting less and less behind the mask, I accepted happily to give this paper because then I don't have to wear a mask. So my paper is From Conflict to Dialogue, so how ecumenism is transforming relations, and I will bring you up to today's ecumenical dialogue, but I will start in the past, because the historic context of 16th century India, in which Francisco Ros wrote his treatises, is rather complex. Furthermore, including the politics of Archbishop Alexio de Meneses, leading to the pseudo-synod of the Emperor in 1599, it is a story of conflict, intolerance towards the other, theological misunderstandings, a story of inacceptance of plurality of ecclesial traditions in other geographical contexts. So my aim in this paper, it's a brief and simple paper, only one passage will be a little bit more complicated, but the rest will be simple, is I will have first a look into Francisco Ros' treatises and then move on to today's ecumenical efforts and agreements already reached. And we will be accompanied continuously by the question of why theological rapprochement is possible today and why it was not possible in the past. So let's first come to the treatises of Francisco Ros. We start with a simple question. So when interpreting a text, some questions always have to be asked. So who wrote what, when, where, and why? This sounds completely simple and even boring, but it is not, because every author has a specific intention when he writes a text. So it is Francisco Ros who is writing polemical treatises in 1586 and 1587 against Mar Abraham and the so-called Nestorians and Indians. What does it mean? It means we have a Western Jesuit who had his experience in ecclesial formation in 16th century Europe, in Catalonia, Valencia, before he came into a new world for him, that is India, where he experienced another ecclesial tradition, which had no roots in the European context. That is, Ros judges a genuinely evolved Christian tradition from the outside and uses his theological instruments, which were cultivated by medieval scholasticism. How important already a small shift in time could be is implied by Father Antony, who rightly asserts in his new book now that at the time when Father Ros wrote his text, he did not know anything about the Synod of Dietmar. That means 10 years after the treatises were written, these treatises turned out to be a powerful weapon, as Father Antony writes, and an opportunity in the hands of Archbishop Meneses from 1595 onwards. So in short, Francisco Ros has a European perspective, he is scholastic theologically trained, he has a Chalcedonian perspective, and he writes before the Pseudo-Synod of Dietmar. So if we have a look into the content of the treatise, it's interesting enough that the most of it deals with Christology. So it is clear that this is in the center of interest, since from a Western perspective on the Council of Ephesus in 431, this was the main reason of the schism, of church separation. Nevertheless, one could also have expected reflections on ritual practices, on liturgical specifics, or on sacramental theology. However, the emphasis of Francisco Ros lies in Christology, and here we have to take a deeper look because he is struggling heavily with terminology. We remember that in the 5th century context of the Council of Ephesus and Chalcedon, 3 Christological approaches were developed. That's what you know easily here. You're trained by Jesuits, so everybody knows it here in this house, so I can be brief. We have a Cyrillian approach, which could be summarized by the sentence mia physis tu theou logos sarkomene, which means one physis of the incarnate God Logos. Then we have a Chalcedonian approach. That's our approach usually, unless those who are here from the ancient Church of the East in the room. 2 physes and 1 prosopon and hypostasis. In Latin, it's already a little bit more problematic because Tertullian is losing persona for prosopon and hypostasis. So it is getting it together. And we have an East Syriac approach, 2 kyane, 2 gnome, 1 pasopa. So it was trained with natures, and we have here the problem is gnomar, hypostasis, that's why I have here's a question mark, and 1 prosopon. And here you can see we have physis on with the Cyrillian approach, 1 physis which is more on the person side. We have 2 physis which more differentiates divinity and humanity, and which is what physis is expressed by Cyril of Alexandria. In Chalcedonian, it's called prosopon and hypostasis, and it's even get more complicated in the East Syriac approach. So each tradition defines their formula with their proper tradition. However, if one now applies the respective terminological definition to the other tradition, then misunderstandings arise. Nature, hypostasis, and prosopon are not defined in the same way by each tradition. So Francisco Ros now attempts to translate and identify the East Syriac Christologic tradition, but he does so from the perspective of a Chalcedonian. The Syriac terminology he has before him, however, was further developed within the Church of the East in the 6th and 7th century, and completely by the outstanding theologian Barba the Great. He's the most outstanding East Syriac speculative theologian and wrote a whole book on Christology. It's the Liber de Unione, the Book of Union. And he's talking about 2 kyane, 2 gnome, and 1 pasopa. So, but he's using the terminology in different ways. Kyana, which is translated usually by nature or physis, is an abstract, is a general nature, which includes all common elements of the members of one species. A kyana cannot exist alone and by itself. It is universal and not particular. Therefore, kyana needs a gnoma. So if you don't understand, it's very simple. So here we have 1 kyana because we are human beings. So our kyana is humanity. But here we are 30 gnome in there so that we can differentiate. So that's why he has to say 2 gnome, 2 kyane, because you have humanity, divinity, but you have Jesus of Nazareth, and you have the logos. So that's why for the gnoma is the individualization of a kyana. Gnoma is somehow closer to the Greek idiotetes or the Latin proprietates than to the Greek hypostasis. Also, Chalcedon identifies hypostasis and prosopon, while the Church of the East makes a subtle differentiation between them. So prosoper and persona propria of a specific gnoma. So the gnoma and prosoper makes the abstract kyana concrete. That was the difficult part of my presentation, so you can relax now again. So if one uses the terms in the Chalcedonian sense, so that should be clear, and Barber the Great from the Chalcedonian sense, like Francisco Ros did, then it becomes very problematic, and it's clear that you identify so-called Nestorianism in there. So you see Francisco Ros was in a dilemma, somehow lost in translation. If you want to know more about this, read the pages 29 to 37 of Father Anthony's book. You will not only find Latin expressions like natura, hypostasis, or prosopon, but also representatione, figura, suppositum, as I learned from the book. So if you now got also lost in translation and terminology, don't worry, because what you really need to remember now is how the paradigm shift in neutral understanding came about, and at the same time the ecumenical rapprochement. So we needed a complete, fresh methodological approach in ecumenism, a new hermeneutical principle for studies in ecumenical texts. And this was prepared by research on the history of dogma in the 20th century, mainly by the Nouvelle Theologie, Yves Congat, Henri de Lubac, but also by works like Alois Grillmeier on Christology. And an important hermeneutical principle thereby was the dialogues made it clear that different terminology could express substantially the same faith. Different terminology, but substantially the same faith. So the church fathers of the 4th to 6th centuries developed their own preferred formulations on different theological topics using the analytical tools of Greek philosophy. So because the theologians involved came from different backgrounds, some technical terms were not understood in the same way. However, if the different formulations are understood in the way each theologian intended the terms to be understood, then it becomes clear that despite the verbal differences and the verbal conflicts, the various formulations could mean the same. So it is of utmost importance to find out what each theologian intended to say with the terms he used, rather than asking what his opponents imagined they read in these expressions. There's a nice ecumenical agreement between the Eastern Orthodox, Byzantine Orthodox Church and the Oriental Orthodox churches reached in Chambézy in 1993, and there I found this passage which I really liked very much. So those two non-Catholic traditions acknowledge the fact that councils and fathers previously anathematized or condemned are orthodox in their teachings. We have understood that both families have loyally maintained the authentic Orthodox Christological doctrine and the unbroken continuity of the apostolic tradition, so they may have used Christological terms in different ways. So this is between Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians, Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox. They did not yet include the so-called Church of the East. But we, from the Catholic Church, came to a common Christological declaration in 1994. Modern relations between the Assyrian Church of the East and the Catholic Church started in 1978. So Catholicos Mardinka IV, whom you see sitting here on the left side, took part in the Mass of the inauguration of Pope John Paul II as one of the representatives and delegates of the various Christian denominations. And then in November 1984, during an official visit, Mardinka IV and John Paul II, they both met and initiated the process of dialogue. From 1984 to 1994, there were several dialogue meetings, and they came to a Christological agreement. By the way, the main draft of this agreement was André Teule, so he was the main drafter of it, assisted by Mababe Soro, but it was mainly André Teule who was very fond of the Formula of Union in 433. And the Common Christological Declaration is really a landmark in ecumenism because the terminology were now rightly used, so that we have no conflicts anymore. Also, the disagreements on the terms Christotokos and Theotokos could be solved there. And so we can read in the Christological Declaration, that is the reason why the Assyrian Church of the East is praying the Virgin Mary as the Mother of Christ, our God and Savior. And the light of the same, or in the light of this same faith, the Catholic tradition addresses the Virgin Mary as the Mother of God, Theotokos, and also as the Mother of Christ, Christotokos. We both recognize the legitimacy and rightness of these expressions of the same faith, and we both respect the preference of each church in her liturgical life and piety. Further, this is the unique faith that we profess in the mystery of Christ. The controversies of the past led to anathemas, bearing on persons and on formulas. The Lord's Spirit permits us understanding better today that the divisions brought about in this way were due in large part to misunderstandings. And my last quotations from this declaration is, whatever our Christological divergences have been, we experience ourselves united today in the confession of the same faith in the Son of God who became man so that we might become children of God by his grace. So the methodological approach and this shift made it possible that we understand the terminology now of each other because we had a different perspective on it. And this also made it possible that following the signing of this common Christological declaration, the dialogue had been put on firm ground. A joint committee for theological dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Assyrian Church of the East was established, and apart from some turbulence that arose in between and led to the dialogue being temporarily suspended, this joint commission continues to be at work. By the way, Father Farrugia, if I'm too long, you don't have to get up, just wave with both hands. It's always good for a Jesuit to do exercise, you know. So I try to be in time. So the official Roman Catholic meetings and dialogues with the Oriental churches have been supported on a non-official level by the Pro Oriente Foundation within the Syriac dialogue, which I may direct, and which includes all the Syriac churches. It's very interesting because we have three Christological traditions. We have the Catholic churches of Syriac tradition, Chaldean, Syrian, Catholic, Maronite, Syro-Malabar, Syro-Malankara Catholic churches, the five. We have two non-Chalcedonian churches, if we would say it from that point of view. I don't like the term so much, but Miaphysite, may or whatever. So it's the Syrian Orthodox Church and the Malankara Orthodox Church, and then we have the two churches of the East, the Assyrian Church of the East and the Ancient Church of the East. So all these Syriac churches we have in there, and that means the official dialogue and the Pro Oriente dialogue support both of it. And among other practical and pastoral steps of collaboration, which were the result of this Christological declaration, these dialogues led also to two more substantial agreements, and I would like to mention them. One is a liturgical one is on sacramental theology. So in 2001, it came to guidelines for the admission to the Eucharist between the Chaldean Church and the Assyrian Church of the East. So the historical and comparative studies on the liturgy done by various scholars also from here and also involved in the Pro Oriente dialogues led to these guidelines. They were prepared by the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity in agreement with the Congregation for Doctrine of Faith and the Congregation for the Eastern Churches. Today this allows that Chaldean Catholics could enter into Eucharistic communion with Assyrians or Assyrian Church of the East, where the diaspora situation makes mutual sacramental support meaningful and necessary. I mean, from a Catholic point, it's not a really new arrangement because we have the Eastern Church Code and also the Ecumenical Directory that allows this. However, the theological historical background of these guidelines are very, very interesting because the problem is this one, the anaphora of Ada and Mari. The problem lay in the fact that the most frequently used Eucharistic prayer in the East Syriac tradition, the anaphora of Mari, does not have a Eucharistic institution narrative. And the institution narrative is pivotal for us. So since for the Catholic Church, this is a constitutive part for Eucharistic prayer, it was also inserted in the anaphora of Ada and Mari in the Chaldean Church in the 16th century. For Catholic theology, the question of whether a Eucharistic prayer without the institution narrative is valid is completely important. Meticulous historical, theological, and liturgical research on ancient liturgical texts clearly demonstrated that the anaphora of Ada and Mari is one of the oldest liturgical prayers in which a tradition is preserved that no longer exists in other churches. And this is very, very interesting. It was signed also by Pope John Paul II, because it recognizes that Christ is present in the gifts of bread and wine, is not exclusively taken into place by specific words like magic. You say the institution narrative. My professor Philip Hanukkah always said, just imagine a priest goes into a bakery and says the institution narrative. Does all the bread now turn into the body of Christ? No, it does not, because it needs the liturgical context. So now you can see that the anaphora of Ada and Mari, that the whole liturgical prayer has consecratory character, and which makes present the Last Supper and the Mysterium Paschale. And with the recognition of the anaphora of Ada and Mari and the guidelines, openness to early church tradition of an Eastern church separated from Rome is shown, and consequently the historical critical view into the past with the recognition of earlier plural developments of Christianity in different cultural expression has theological consequences. So what does it mean for our theology when we talk about forma substantia and materia? My last point, there's also a common statement on sacramental life in this, which came up in 2017. Over the centuries, the Catholic Church, especially through the preliminary work of the scholastic theologians of the Middle Ages, and also due to the shock of the Reformation, has specified its theology on sacraments, especially with the Council of Trent. It's a Western perspective, and also defines the number 7. The Assyrian Church of the East has also 7 sacraments. I could explain in the discussion why. The number has been adopted through encounter between East and West. It came from the West into the East, but it has a completely different list, namely that of Abdisho Paprika, which was you can read it in his Kitab de Maganitha, the Book of the Pearl, and this is the list. You can see it. It's priesthood, it's holy baptism, oil of unction, oblation of the body and blood of Christ, which would be the Eucharist. So far so good. Absolution. And then the holy leaven, Malka, called Malka, and the sign of the life-giving cross. And we can read in this common statement, during many centuries, due to the massive and sometimes very painful historic situations, the Church of the East could not communicate in a normal way with the rest of Christianity, situated within the Greco-Roman area, the rest of Christianity. Some later developments in sacramental theology and practice, which gradually were adopted in the Greco-Roman era, did not affect the Church of the East. Remaining extremely faithful to its proper apostolic origin, however, the Assyrian Church of the East conserved and developed its sacramental patrimony stemming from the apostolic age. This patrimony represents a unique source and testimony for the whole Church. So this is an awareness of plural developments, and it also challenges again our very own Latin sacramental theology. Just as much as the final statement of this document, while celebrating sacramental rites according to different liturgical and cultural traditions, in essence, Catholics and Assyrians both share the same sacramental faith and the same sacramental life. In brackets, although they have different lists. Their sacramental rites can therefore be considered as complementary expressions of a unique divine reality, unfolding its wonderful richness in a diversity of ecclesial traditions. So I think some of our systematic theologians and dogmatists would have a lot to pick up here, and probably also to bring into the Protestant Catholic or Orthodox Catholic dialogues. So the historical critical view into the past with the recognition of the earliest plural developments in different cultural forms has theological consequences. Ecumenical dialogues have theological consequences. In particular, looking into the sources of the Christian Orient is worthwhile because the theology does not conform with the Western churches, and this includes also the Eastern Orthodox, the Catholic and the Protestant mainstream churches. The hermeneutical principle remains that one must understand what the respective theologian, what the respective tradition wanted to express with their terminology and not what theological or ecclesiastical opponents saw in it. It is about the substance of faith and not about the literal agreement. So the diversity of cultural, liturgical, theological, and spiritual traditions has been a historical reality since antiquity. Theology and ecclesiastical history that is committed to the oikumene, to the inhabited earth, will have to step out of its narrow view of confessionalism or denominationalism. Ecumenism and dialogue always means interaction. In this sense, theology and church history always need to be reflected upon, and the theology of the West also needs the theology of the Orient. Who knows better than you here? And fortunately, we have also been learning since the 16th century. Thank you very much.
Well, Professor, I greatly appreciated this theological dimension, though I somehow regret I didn't get up to tell you your time is over. Okay. So, now we have the star of the evening, Father Antony Macherry, Professor of Oriental Church History and Research Methodologies for the doctoral students at the PIO. He received his PhD in Church History in 2016 from the Gregorian University in 2016. Since 2017, he has been at the PIO. And the present book is his second contribution. I agree that he is a budding scholar, and he wrote a number of articles for me, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Farrugia. How to close it? This cursor is not working.
What's wrong?
Thank you very much, Father Farrugia, and good evening to every one of you, especially for the great intervention that our experts have already made about the subject theologically and contextually. So I need not to enter into the details of the general background. And also good evening to all those who are following us online, especially from the States. So this is my general title, Ros as an Outlier, Methodological and Historiographical Problematics. Introduction. The task of a historian, I approach the whole episode from a historian's perspective because I am trained in history. The task of a historian is to correctly place sources or documents in their historical setting and to interpret them faithfully in the same setting, sine, ira, et studio. Historiographically and methodologically speaking, broad generalizations always include exceptions and nuanced regions of however. An expert is not satisfied with the broad brush strokes. Instead, he or she focuses on those exceptions. The exceptions do not invalidate at the same time the cogency of the general conclusions or the general principles already established. If I borrow the ideas of Stephen Jay Gould, famous natural historian, among experts of any academic field, attention properly flows to the exceptions. The exceptions or the outliers are the interesting details that fuel scholarship at the highest levels. Now, this apparent conflict between the generalizations and exceptions is tangible also in historiographical questions. A micro focus on outliers brings out the voices often ignored and suppressed, even in mission narratives. Francisco Ros, an exceptionally talented outlier, an exception beyond any doubt, made profound impact on the evangelization praxis that even surpassed his time. Here, as an outsider in India, he addresses a troubling theological issue about which I need not to speak anymore, of the church of his time. And the present book places, with all its shortcomings, this long-standing question in its historical setting. The second part of my presentation, this is the missionary premises. We have to understand why a Latin world thought like this. This is the interest of the historians. So these are the missionary premises, whether we like it or not, of the early modern period. First one. For Ros, the Church of the Thomas Christians, an apostolic church, and the Church of the East Syrians, or the Nestorians, inverted comma, or Babylonians, are two different realities historically. He defines the first as the faithful of Saint Thomas, Fideles Divi Thome, the sheep, oves, the Church of Saint Thomas, Ecclesia Divi Thome, witnesses against the wolves, it's very, very strong, Testes contra lupos, and the second group he calls them as Nestorians, the Church of the Nestorians. Interestingly, this book, the first treatise, presents the second group in its title as the East Syrians. Maybe the experts of today use the term Syri Orientalis. Ros writes his treatises against the second group. This is the basic premise to understand the whole episode. Second premise, the Nestorians, inverted comma, Mar Simon, for example, he was present in India, and the East Syrian Chaldean Catholics, represented by Mar Abraham, Mar Joseph, etc., who were living in India, had the same theological identity. Ros doesn't make the distinction between the Nestorians, the traditional East Syrians, and the Chaldeans. For him, everyone is the same. Heretical in the eyes of, this identity is heretical in the eyes of Ros, because both these groups employed the same liturgical text and version of Peshitta sacred scripture. This was the problem, and it is dealt in the book. Third premise, the Syriac books found in India were imported from the East Syria. Therefore, the reported shortcomings of the church in Malabar were only concerning ignorance, according to Ros, not heresies. Instead, he makes a differentiation very clear. The East Syrians were not ignorant, and they purposefully corrupted the pristine faith here by not amending their books. Introduction of the present treatise. Ros employed, to bring out this idea, the Latin word naufragium, shipwreck, in the introduction of this treatise. He would like to say there was a pristine faith here, an apostolic church directly evangelized by Saint Thomas the Apostle, but there was a shipwreck in the centuries. So we have to do something now. Fourth premise. Yet this church in India and her unique and acceptable traditions were to be promoted and supported. But by undoing completely the Nestorian hierarchical jurisdiction in India. This undoing was practically done with the Synod of Dietmar. So what are the acceptable traditions that can be included? According to Ros, the long-standing use of Syriac, the liturgical language, he was the best professor in India, and strict fasting rules, local customs, common recitation of the divine office, general setting of the celebration of the Mass, etc. So these are the acceptable traditions that he wanted to wholeheartedly, and the people liked him because he was praying with the St. Thomas Christians, Syriac divine office. Okay. Fifth premise. Ros was never an inquisitor in the strict sense of the term. We have already brought this issue, but his approach was always inquisitorial towards the East Syrian hierarchy in India, especially headed by Mar Abraham in India. There is a reason.
According to Ros, he is a converted Nestorian. He became a Catholic. He came in India in 1556, but became a Catholic in 1565 in Rome. So Ros, in his approach towards the Thomas Christians, instead tried to practice, diplomatically, il modo suave, gentle means, with a view to reducing them fully to the Catholic fold. Now, we introduced a technical term in the mission terminology, reducing. What is that? Sixth premise, coming from the Portuguese verb reduzir, is a missionary vocabulary, meaning bringing back, restore, reform to the Catholic fold. Means, here in the context, bringing back those who were originally Catholics but lost their Christian faith somehow. We have to be very careful. This reduction is not used in the sense of the Jesuit reductions of Paraguay. That's a different reality. Seventh premise. There were two Christian groups to be reduced in the early modern Christian Syriac. Who are they? Mar Abraham, the Chaldean Catholic, and his Chaldean Catholic Malabar faithful centered in Ankamali, and Mar Simon, a Nestorian, traditional East Syrian, and his Nestorian Malabar faithful centered in Kaduturiti, another see, unofficially started, each with different local archdeacons, different metropolitans. And the Church of the East wanted to divide the church according to a miniature form of the Church of the East. That was the project of Mar Abraham. So Ros, both were maldites, the headache. We just understand it in history. Eighth premise. But the complete reduction was found to be a difficult process because the Christians in general did not want to lose their age-old languages and customs. In Spanish, costumbres. In Malayalam, these customs, both native and East Syrian or Chaldean or Oriental, were known as the Thoma Marga, way, law, or religion of the Thomas, Saint Thomas. Okay. Ninth premise. Ros applied a very novel way to tackle this very, very serious crisis. What is that? How did he tackle? Achieve a distant reduction of the Thomas Christians within their Chaldean garb and Syriac trimmings. This is a typical practice of accommodatio. Accommodatio. I don't use the word accommodation because it is manipulated and misunderstood many times in our contemporary time. So accommodatio, the mission terminology, implies a very careful appropriation of the seemingly unfavorable elements in a mission field with a view to achieving a final reduction of this apostolic church. The end is the anticipated common good, peace, salvation in the vocabulary of the missionaries, conversion or reconversion. Nota bene, accommodatio was not the same as today's concepts of adaptation, inculturation, etc., or interculturation. In this praxis, Ros appeared exactly as a Chaldean. We will see how. 10th premise. Similarly, Ros, the co-founder of the new Madurai mission, led by Roberto Di Nobili, Roman Jesuit, defined that mission: achieve a distant reduction of the Brahmins of Madurai within their own civil rights and Sanskrit trimmings. You can see the comparison because the methodology is the same. The context is different, whether it is China, whether it is Japan. This is the methodology, but the elements are different. In this praxis, Roberto Di Nobili, SJ, appeared as an Indian Brahmin sannyasi, means a world renouncer in every aspect, in food, in dress, in everything. Okay. Now, the end part of my intervention here, the third part, let's listen to him in his own words. Just to understand, sometimes it's a little, I just translate his words exactly word by word to communicate or to understand who was he actually. Okay. About the diversity of rites and customs in the church. For this reason, having diversity of rites and customs is not to be repugnant or objectionable to the mystical body of the Catholic Church. Instead, These rites are like different organs united among them with the bond of faith, and the same diversity does not impede the unity of the Holy Church. This is taken from my first book, so all these page numbers are indicating test ground of accommodation. Ros against bringing the customs of the church under church law. He's very seriously against bringing the customs of the church, whether it is oriental, whether it is local, he's seriously against bringing under church law. If His Holiness Pope confirmed the above such synod of Dietmar, he would be placing all these Christians in a state of mortal sin, as they would not obey it. If His Holiness approved, I say, what has to do with the customs in such a way as to make a law? As great evils would follow from such procedure, I request your paternity. Paternity means Assistant General of that time, Portuguese Assistant General. We have South Asian Assistancy General now, Father M.K. George with us. So he is requesting the Assistant General, your paternity, for the love of our Lord, on receiving this information, to use your influence in the Roman Curia so that this step, ruinous to souls, may be averted, and let the Holy Father be informed of it. So, legitimization of customs, resistance, disobedience, and mortal sin. This is the logic. So he says, don't legitimize the customs. Finish. That's why the Synod of Dietmar was never approved by Pope, because they blocked here in Rome. On the psychological rationale behind accommodatio based on a tendency in the human nature, Ros, a humanist, quotes the words of Publius Ovidius Naso, Roman poet, died in the 1st century AD. Nitimur in Latin first, nitimur in vetitum semper cupimusque negata. Complete meaning. It's available in RC. We always tend towards forbidden things and look forward to obtaining what we are denied. Ros, the context. Ros portrays here the customs and the past of this local church in Malabar as her nostalgic, harmless, accidental elements to be acceptable. Ros, as a very strict Latin missionary, for no compromise with faith, the Catholic faith, but for compromise with customs. About his Jesuit companions, who created ideological friction in mission by rejecting the praxis of accommodatio. It was a big problem. The seminary in Vaipikota was divided with two groups of the Jesuits. One for accommodation under the leadership of Ros, the other group under the leadership of Toscano for Latinization. Ros, again a humanist, cites an aphorism of Terence, the Roman playwright, in Latin, veritas odium parit, the complete sentence. Flattery procures friends. The truth begets hatred. He is using these words against the other group which was against his methodology, mission methodology. A strong criticism against those who rejected austerity and accommodatio in mission. This is against, again, his own order, the men of his own order, the Jesuits. Woe to us who, being obliged to imitate that apostolic spirit, should try to extinguish it and think we do a work pleasing to God by bringing about the ruin of that mission. We are still novices in the missions. We have no experience. We do not possess the language as we ought. We are unable to read their books, and we calumniate what we cannot imitate. He's speaking about Syriac and Sanskrit, the most very famous languages, and Telugu, etc. He knew many other languages. So, about a bishop's position, he was an archbishop. He was a bishop for 6 years, then 9 years, then became an archbishop of the St. Thomas Christians. About a bishop's position, according to our Chaldean, he speaks that according to our Chaldean, he means as he is speaking as a Chaldean. Chaldean means the Syriac language, and he translated one of the Chaldean sources, bonam servitutem querit. A bishop means he gets fast and hard slavery. And he had to suffer a lot. About the relation between the human nature and authority, said against Archbishop Menezes of Goa. Ros, the exercise of authority makes a man come out of his shell. and it causes the river to overflow its banks. This is about the complete destruction. He is asking for the traditional metropolitan title of the St. Thomas Christians, which was pirated, taken away from the Sea of Angamali. This is the context. Archbishop Menezes wanted to be the primate of Orient, primate of India, so he didn't want to give away that title. So, 2 years before the Synod of Dietmar, 1597, it's impossible to force the Thomas Christians to do the things that they are not yet prepared for, given that they are incapable of making changes in matters pertaining to religion. I know them better than anyone else. He lived 40 years in Malabar. He spoke, the sources say he was speaking Malayalam better than the natives. I don't know. People were crying listening to his passion sermon. About the role of accommodatio in mission, this is the final slide I have to. About the role of accommodatio in mission 2 years after the Synod of Dietmar. I want to ease my conscience in this matter. Hereafter, these people in Malabar cannot be led in the old way using force. It would be equal to flinging them into the path of absolute ruin. If they are alienated and break into rebellion, we know by experience that we have no longer any influence over them. Anyhow, it's important that His Holiness Pope should be cautioned to deal with these people with extreme gentleness and suavity, and to restore to the Church its ancient metropolitan title, because their obedience to the Roman Church is of greater consequence than their subjection to the Archbishop of Goa as metropolitan. And I was a little speedy, but I think it was communicated just to get a general picture of Ros. It's a very interesting figure. He liked the customs. He liked even the East Syrian customs. Okay, of course, he added the institution narrative in the Adai Mari. He added 5 or 6 Latin elements in the pre-synodal mass, and that is we can expect from a Latin missionary. But these words make me think there is a lot of things. We cannot label him as a Latinizer. We cannot simply label him as a Latin missionary. We cannot simply label him as an inquisitor. We cannot simply label him as a Chaldean. He's something, everything. Thank you very much. And
well, I thank Father Antony because of his presentation. He has certainly read his book.
Yeah.
And however, perhaps you might not believe me, the thing I liked most of what I read in his book was what he said about method. That if you ignore method, you can't have the status questiones. So listen what came to mind. One had studied at the conservatory. So he went to visit his old maestro. He didn't know he was dead. So he asked a colleague, I can't find my maestro. What is he doing? And the colleague said, nothing. What? Nothing? Isn't he composing? And the colleague answered, composing. He is decomposing. And this is, I think, a quip, a linguistic quip, which really illustrates a point which I liked about method in your book. You have what went wrong with the historiography was the wrong method. Okay, having said that, now we open to the corona, as we say in Italian, that is, questions can be addressed to all those who have spoken except myself, who have said nothing. Okay, so please, you should come here, I think.
Yes.
Father Antony.
Anthony.
Yes.
Here is the chair. No, yes, the chair left. Father Farucha.
No,
Oh, okay, it is on the left. Okay, so, will somebody break the ice?
May I start with, I don't know to ask to whom, because we several times heard that it was mentioned that Ros used the term Nestorians, both for Chaldeans and for East Oriental Assyrians. So, what is the reason that that doesn't make this distinction, that both of them are Nestorians?
That's an interesting question. No missionary in India, they accepted the Catholic communion of the East Syrians. No missionary in India, they accepted the Catholic communion of these. That happened in 1552. The reason behind that, they were telling they are using the same books. They didn't correct the texts. They entered into communion yesterday in the defense with about that interesting figure, Georgis Varda. That what was her name? Dahlia highlighted here some text, very interesting text, used by the Chaldean Catholic Church, in which they were cancelling the so-called heretical elements in their liturgical texts. The problem with Ros, that why do, if they, he's asking specifically a question, if they entered into the Catholic communion under the leadership of Sulaka, why did they not change the text? So all of them are Nestorians. But very interestingly, the first treatise, he calls them East Syrians. Very interestingly, because that's the name that the experts of the field today, today's terminology. But he changed, in the second treatise, he became more strategic and changed, he used the word, de erroribus Nestorianorum qui in India orientali versamdur. The Nestorians who are living in India, instead of saying East Syrians. So there is a strategic, polemical purpose behind. That's why they don't call him as Chaldeans, Nestorians, everybody is the same. They don't accept the 1552, let's say, communion with the Catholic Church. That's why he criticizes Sulaka. And Audisho in the treatise telling that they presented a wrong, what we call, masked profession of faith, Nestorian profession of faith in Rome, in the format of Catholic faith. That's why reason behind. And you have some comments about that? Yeah.
Well, other questions?
Can I also
Yes,
speak?
please.
So, I mentioned several times that what I like in the phenomenon is precisely this gentleness. We see the gentleness of the person, but we should not forget certain conditions. The Chaldean church, the Chaldean jurisdiction in India was not accepted by the Portuguese. Because of the padroado rights, they objected from the very beginning to the presence of Chaldean bishops. Now, in Mar Abraham's Staticon, the letter of recommendation that the Pope sent, in which he asked the Portuguese authorities to accept Mar Abraham, there was a clause, and saying, as long as he remains faithful to the confession. So, in order to remove this Chaldean jurisdiction, it was almost obligatory to prove heresy, because that was permitted by the very letter of the Pope. So, there was an interest in proving heresy, and it was easy because Mar Abraham indeed did not correct the books. He indeed was faithful to the customs. And there is in his handwriting, there is a curse on Nestorius in his personal book of the Nomocanon, and there he writes something very interesting, that we are happy to confess the Roman faith, we are happy to confess that Christ is two natures in one pneuma, in one hypostasis, according to the Roman innovation. Hedata Romaita. That is to say, he considered the Roman faith that he accepted as equivalent to the ancient faith of the Church of the East, but an innovation. So there was an interest in proving that the Chaldeans are Nestorians, and in this, Ros was faithfully serving both post-Tridentine Catholicism and the Portuguese crown. He did it with very different methods from other missionaries. This is why we have this discussion, whether he was an inquisitor or not.
Okay. No, I just want to add one more point. I said that there were two groups. They wanted to establish in Malabar a kind of miniature church, the traditional East Syrian church and the Chaldean Catholic Church. So there were two groups. The second group, the Nestorian group, inverted comma, was reduced only in 1594. More than 500 people, they were taken from the part of Kaduturiti, Todupura, etc. And they were brought to Vaipikota, and there was a ceremony in which the previous year, their archdeacon had passed away with a cancerous tongue, etc. And their archbishop also, metropolitan bishop also was passed away in Lisbon. So in that context, they made a ceremonial sermon public, and they were reduced to the Catholic fold, inverted comma, 1594, just before the Synod of Dietmar. So Ros is living in that context. Ros struggled a lot to resolve the schism. What happened there, it reflected also in Malabar. And many people were secretly supporting the East Syrian church, and they looked at Mar Abraham as a kind of, he cheated us. He cheated us because he became a Catholic. So there was an opposition. That's why Alessandro Valignano, a famous missionary canon lawyer, he was dealing with this problem, with this conflict with the two groups in Malabar. So we have to understand historically, there was a conflict for the Latin mission. That's why they took the help of the Portuguese soldiers to oust Mar Simon from, the Nestorian bishop from India in 1583, but his community continued as an independent hierarchy with Archdeacon Jacob, other one Archdeacon George of the Cross. So there was a conflict. It's a very serious situation in Malabar. And they had to somehow describe Mar Abraham as a kind of Chaldean ignoto. He's also Chaldean, but he's using the same textbooks and he's not correcting. So they didn't want to differentiate between Nestorians or the Chaldeans. I think I explained already, yeah.
Yeah.
May I ask a question? Yes? Well, what struck me in the presentation of Professor Perczel was that you said that Ros translated, so to say, Latin into Syriac, Latin
Yes.
theology into Syriac, meaning that he also coined a Latin theological terminology in a Syriac dress.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which only happened in the Chaldean tradition, according to me, 100 years later only with Patriarch Joseph II.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah. Well, has it already been investigated whether maybe some of the material translated by Ros went back to the Middle East to help, because Joseph II, yeah, did all his work of translation of Tridentine works into Syriac with the help also of Latin missionaries who were living in the Diyarbakir region. Could there be any connection? Or is that too far-fetched?
No, that's a very interesting question, and I don't know whether these works of Ros, how to say, it's a very difficult methodological question to prove that it is really Ros. We were able to do it concerning this fantastic interfaith dialogue, which was earlier attributed to Joseph Cariatil. But luckily, there is one work which is signed by Ros, his statutes, and the language is the same. And there is also a testimony in a letter here in a Roman archive about the existence of the dialogue at the beginning of the 18th century. So before Cariatil grew up, at least, that dialogue was already there. But it's very difficult. But none of those texts were copied in the Middle East. That's for sure. They exist only in Indian manuscripts. Or if they were, this has not come out yet. But this is a very interesting question, whether that it is absolutely pioneering. So even if I say, okay, he was a son of his times, he was an incredible humanist, an incredible erudite. I think he was one of the most prolific authors writing in Syriac in his time. And this was unknown. So I would like to bring this out because very few things have been published as yet from our work. But this is fantastic, and it seems that it had a great impact in India, so much so that these works were copied by Jacobites, by Chaldeans, everybody. It became a common patrimony of the Indian Syriac Church. But it seems to be unknown elsewhere, and I don't know why. The translation of Pedro Gomez, it was written in Latin, translated into Japanese for the seminary in Nagoya, and only one treatise on the 7 sacraments was translated into Syriac, and it's unmistakably the style of Ros, because not a single sentence remains the same. Instead of the legalistic terminology of Pedro Gomez, it becomes full of patristic quotations, full of spirituality. When he translated, he rewrote things. It's not known anywhere else. There are many copies in India, not a single copy outside of India.
Well,
There is a question.
My question is to Father Macherry. You said that Bishop Ros at least wanted to apply the same methodological principle with regard to the St. Thomas Christians and also in the Madurai mission undertaken by the Nobili. But there is an essential distinction to be made. The mission under the Nobili was to convert non-Christians. He was dealing mainly with non-Christians. But Ros, on the other hand, was dealing with Christians. Did he make this distinction? Did he make some distinction between these two communities, or was he in favor of applying the same methodological principle to both these communities?
It's a very interesting question, and many ask the same question. Very interesting question. I would say, as I said, according to Ros, I quote him from my memory, the Society of Jesus was able to enter China, Japan, Madurai, and now in Serra, means the Malabar Church, only by accommodating ourselves in the lifestyle, in the customs of the local people. So according to him, maybe one or that quotation is seen in my first book. So the methodology of accommodatio is the same. For the Christians of St. Thomas, he was helping de nobili, but it's a kind of reconversion. The other is conversion, because they are Gentiles, completely Gentiles. There is no Christian faith introduced. But these Christians are already there, Christians of St. Thomas. That's why he is introducing the introduction of the treatise now. Pristine faith they had. Their bishops were always Syrians, but it was corrupted. Their scripture is corrupted, so we have to save them. So using how to save them using the same methodology at the level of customs. In Madurai, they are using rites. That's why Malabar rites controversy. That nothing to do with the St. Thomas Christians. So in the 18th century, there emerged a new problem in Madurai. It's known as Malabar rites controversy. So that is to do with the rites of the Brahmins. In the same way, the rites of the Thomas Christians, like they were sharing the same rites, for example, applying the sandal paste, applying the kudumai, a tuft of hair. They were using, the Christians of St. Thomas had, and the Christians of St. Thomas were wearing something like a punul, but vendinga, we say, but similar. And the custom of making baths, purificatory baths, but de nobili said, no, the Christians of St. Thomas are making baths not as a superstitious ceremony, and they are coming from a humid territory, so they take bath as it started with a kind of common sense. And all other meanings to the rites, whether in Madurai, whether it is Christian society, they are sharing the same cultural rites about the social customs. But about the Chaldean customs, they are using the same, Ros is applying the same methodology. For example, the celebration of the Mass. He said Bema should be there. He said the archdeacon or the deacon should be following, the procession should be there. He said, but the problem is that the Chaldean tradition, he did not accept the hierarchy. This was a difference. He was an inquisitor against the hierarchy. But he was very free. According to him, rites are accidental. It comes and goes. What is important, as Mar Abraham said, faith and baptism is the key principle. So they are working together de nobili, and to a certain extent, Matteo Ricci was in Malabar. He said, this is very interesting. This church, they use only two different languages, but the faith is the same. Before going to China, he was, Camilla, she knows that. Before going to China, he was expressing, these are the same churches, only their customs are different. We pray in Latin and they pray in Syriac. This is only the difference. We are the same. We have the same faith and we have the same traditions, etc. No? So this is, your question is very interesting. Many ask the same question, but by principle, all are the same methodologically. Reduction in their rites and in their trimmings. One is Syriac, but the other is Sanskrit. Or in China, what the language changes, Matteo Ricci or Alessandro Valignano in Japan, the methodology is the same, but I think it's clear. Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask another question? It is in connection with that. In order to understand the opposition of Ros towards the hierarchy of the East Syrian Church, or their St. Thomas Christians' communion with the East Syrian Church, in order to understand his opposition towards that, should we not also consider the Portuguese colonial policy? Because that communion would directly oppose the colonial interest of the Portuguese. Is that taken into account when you proposed that schema which you have presented?
That's also, I would say, is a very interesting question, but Ros was against the Portuguese. The Govan Inquisition was completely against Ros because he is not a Portuguese. He is a Catalan Jesuit. The Inquisition made a comment once that we should not believe this guy because he is not a Portuguese. We should not take him seriously because the Catalonians, I'm sorry, I think nobody is originally Catalonian here. The Catalonians are micromanagers, very scrupulous, and we don't believe him. So this is the position of the Govan Inquisition, and they don't take him very seriously because he was against the Portuguese policy, and 90% of the Portuguese officials were against the principle of acomodatio. That's why the Madurai mission was blocked by the Portuguese. And that's why Ros is saying about the conflict in the society, Jesuits. No? According to the provincial, you are changing the things, the veritas odium parit. So according to a new provincial, you are taking a different procedure, according to the Portuguese identity of the, and when a Spanish man comes, you are taking a different position. But I am saying the only thing, the methodology. You should not change according to the circumstance, opportunist, no? So I think Ros once wrote to the Father General, sent to us in India from all nationality, not only from Portugal. We need Italians, because Italians were having humanistic formation. And all the accommodationists were Italians. They thought differently. They applied a new principle, how to accept the culture, how to accept the differences, without imposing our way into their community. And this was something, and no Portuguese was there to practice this principle. And that's why there was a big conflict between the Portuguese nationality of the missionaries and the other nationalities of the missionaries. Of course, this played also at the level of Inquisition, because the Portuguese did not want an East Syrian jurisdiction in India, naturally. And we have to say the Pope has accepted the East Syrian jurisdiction, had accepted the jurisdiction of Mar Abraham, the Chaldean jurisdiction. But according to the legal procedures, the Portugal had all the rights to decide what to do with the Indian mission, who should be the bishop, how it should be administered. So the politics also playing a part into it.
And it was a Portuguese mission.
Yeah,
so
Ros is supporting the official, otherwise he cannot. Somebody was, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Father, for your presentation. You have mentioned Ros considered the Thomas Christians were using a corrupted scripture. I mean, I would like to get more information on Ros' stand on the people's use of Peshita, and if it were he considered this as a corrupted scripture, what did he do to amend them, or was there something on his approach towards the people's version of Bible?
I think the theologians can speak more about it because Ros is citing the comparative presentation of the Latin Vulgata and how it was changed, according to him, in the Syriac Peshita. And the comparative study of these two scriptures, because verses are different. Some verses are not there, and it is, according to Sebastian Brock, there is a reason. And some passages were, I won't say manipulated, but some passages were reconstructed according to the theological position of the Church of the East. And what was in use in Malabar or in Malankara was the Peshita Bible. And it was for a Latin missionary, especially the very serious theological points, the verses were different. And if you're interested, you can get the book. There are 5 Syriac, get the book means read the book. It is explained there how the differences are made in each versions and how it became problematic. And Ros was, of course, as a Latin missionary, he was explaining all the changes introduced in the Syriac Peshita was with a motive to bringing out the idea or the theology of two Christs. The Nestorian wanted to divide Christ, human and divine. I don't want to enter into the theological discourse now. That's why I said the theologians can speak about it. But there are. He accuses on the basis of some kind of evidence. According to Father Huse, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but anyway, he said, okay, this should not be taken very seriously. But my position is that we can explain these changes in the Syriac Peshita historically, theologically. There is a reason for that. There were some reconstructions were made in the Syriac Peshita in history. And there are theological reasons for that. So I suggest that we theologically present it, why this Syriac Peshitta was different, especially some words. Brock has studied about 2 or 3 verses, and the similar application can be applied to other verses also. Please.
Since he considered as corrupted, what was his, did he practically make some amendments, or did, as he has done for liturgy with Adai and Mari, did he do something to correct?
What I say, the Syriac scripture was, every text was, as they said, it was corrected. During the Synod of Diamber, there was an auto da fe of all the texts, no? There was a burning ceremony, and they corrected single all the lines, and all the words were taken out. And only with the corrected version, we have now the Syriac Peshitta of that time, only the corrected versions. So what they did, they corrected the verse, and they included the Latin Vulgata version where the verses were missing. Some verses were missing in the Syriac Peshitta, some were differently given, and it is explained there. And he did the correction not in the East Syrian Church, but for the use of the St. Thomas Christians, he made the corrections after the Synod of Diamber. Okay.
May I add something here? We have both versions. So in our digitization,
Microphone closer. Close to your mouth.
Closer, okay. So in our digitization work, we found the corrected version. We found also the translations, most probably done by Ros or his Syriacist entourage. There was, for example, the Book of Revelations missing. And so the Book of Revelations were translated from the Latin into Syriac in India. Again, a text which you don't find anywhere else. But we have the manuscripts with the Book of Revelations translated from the Latin text. But the uncorrected text remained in usage. So we have examples from later time of the uncorrected text, because this proud nation, as Ros said, did not obey. And we have also the manuscript, also concerning this idea whether concrete texts were condemned or just concrete texts were condemned, because the condemned texts we have found. And we understand, and we have found them in the very form in which they were condemned, often without the title. There is an anonymous gospel commentary which was transmitted anonymously. We found 2 copies of it from the 18th, 19th centuries. But it is in fact from the gospel commentary of Ishayab of Merv. But Ros did not know it was Ishayab of Merv because the title was removed. And we found it precisely in this form.
Yeah. And one more addition, if it is time.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, we can. Just to add with what Professor Istvan said, after the Synod of Diamber, there was an order for all the 70 churches. They have to bring all the books from their houses, churches, capellas, and everything. And there was a burning ceremony before every church. And we have found out some of the manuscripts which have not been corrected. You are right. That means all the books were not presented to burn. And in some of the non-Catholic communities of Kerala, in Malabar, we can get some of these copies of the earlier versions, which was not corrected also. Of course, you would have found out. That means disobedience in all people were not obeying Menezes to bring the books, and there was a solemn ceremony of burning ceremony of all the manuscripts. So everybody did not obey his order. That's why they said it is a miraculous miraculous. The synod Dietmar was miraculous, and you have to obey. They were creating a kind of deterrent effect, fear, to bring the books. So it's a, okay.
Well,
There is one more question, Father.
I want to thank and congratulate, I'm not a historian, but I found the presentations of Dr. Antony and all of you very, very profound, and I want to thank you and congratulate you first. Now, if I am allowed to ask an applied question, primarily because I'm not a historian, like especially Dr. Winkler, did I pronounce your name right? I don't know. Both of you had a very strong ecumenical tone in your presentation. Now, just bringing our issues to contemporary day, why is that this ecumenical and this dialogical spirit not found in the recent problems in the Syro-Malabar Church? Why is that you are not able to influence that kind of a spirit? It's an applied question, you feel free not to respond. But I found, while there is so much of a strong tradition of ecumenism, but a current problem has not been illumined by the rich tradition of the church and all history of ecumenism.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and we have this problem of reception of ecumenical results, you know, and it's a dialogue. So sometimes you have a practical ecumenism on the parish level, so it depends in which geographical region you are. So not in India maybe that much, or more in the European level, and then you have a high-level ecumenism, but which does not reach the parishes. You know, I mean that the strongest problems now in South India is not the Catholic, let's say a Syro-Malabar Orthodox problem. It's even an inner-Orthodox problem, because the Syrian Orthodox Church, which is in contact with the Patriarch of Antioch, the so-called Jacobite group, has problems with the Malankara Orthodox Church, and they struggle and have court suits and so on, and even the government is sometimes using that, you know, so we have to be clear about this also, you know, so that there are political issues in there by the BNP, you know, so and which involve, you know, we have within, for example, within the Orthodox Church now a complete disaster. If you see the Russian Orthodox and the Ukrainian Orthodox, it's not always a dialogue between ecumenists, and sometimes within church. When churches get instrumentalized by politics, then it becomes a problem, and when churches let them instrumentalize. You know. So we are working on different levels. For example, the ecumenical officer of the Synod of the Syro-Malabar Church, he did this doctorate with us in Salzburg, so he would be properly educated from Oriente. We get them out and have contact with them and educate ecumenical officers, but it's a difficult work which needs a lot of didactics and a lot of patience.
It was mentioned this case, Dietmar out de fe, what is very sad part of the story. If there is any similarity with this Dietmar out de fe, this what's happened to the Maronite Church, maybe someone can say, or
Yeah.
maybe Herman.
Yeah. According to me, when I studied, excuse me, when reading your book and looking into the text of the Dietmar, it reminds me so vividly of what happened to the Maronites. And according to me, so we have the same. I saw Maronite manuscripts, which were of lists of Syriac books, in which the Maronite prelates had been forced by the Jesuits to indicate whether they were Orthodox. If not, they had to be burnt, yeah? Or whether they could be corrected, etc. So it's exactly the same system. And so a methodological question, according to me, is there any connection between both, or has it ever been studied? I do not know.
No, I have the same information. I have not studied in detail the Maronite context, but I think this is the same methodological.
It is the same mentality and
Exactly.
yeah.
You have not studied yet, you're still young. So-
No, what I say, that's right, Maronite.
Regarding this mentality, it was mentioned during discussion, or Antony mentioned, or I don't know, someone else also, but it was mentioned this adaptation, accommodatio, and special how Ros make distinction between orthodoxy of the faith, where he was very strict, and flexibility regarding customs. But as it was mentioned, we can see, it was possible to see that even Jesuits, they was divided, assuming it was two groups. What is the reason, or this nationality? You mentioned Portuguese, another Catalonian, or we can see also, I don't know, as background or Council of Trento, of effect of Council of Trento. I don't know if there is something similarity, this doctrinal teaching or national teaching, no, national report or both together.
I can respond to it if you don't. See, these missionaries are coming from a divided Europe, confessionally speaking. The Protestant Revolution, and Catholic Reformation, and the Trent Council, all of them are very much involved in the uniformity of everything possible. Uniformity of faith, uniformity of customs, because they don't want to create psychological, they are defensive. So when they see for the first time a different group of the Christians in India with a language nobody understood then, and with the East Syrian sacramental system, no confession, no confirmation according to them, and no the ordination ceremony with the instrumentorum, what we call traditio instrumentorum. All this created big conflict because according to the matter and form category of the Trent Council sacramental system, it was not working in India because matter was not there, form was not there. So for a Latin mentality, how a sacrament can be perfect, matter, intention, form, I think this is the essential elements. And for them, and that's why Ros was even telling one time, no, when they are blessing the sacrament of baptism, they're pronouncing Syriac wrongly. They do not understand Syriac. They just read and write. No, read and write to say the Holy Mass. They're pronouncing wrongly. What he wanted to communicate to Rome in the beginning stages, that the form of the sacrament is wrong. If I pronouncing the absolution formula wrongly, the Syriac, that means the form is risky. So this is a, I would say, a highly scrupulous situation they are coming from. The Portuguese were very in a severe situation. But Italians and Spanish, we see the difference. They are a little more. There was a change in Ros. In 1619, he's writing to the theologians in Rome. Very interesting thing. Father General, I don't understand the conflict in the East Syrian ordination ceremony without the traditio instrumentorum. Traditio instrumentorum means using the ordination ceremony, the wine, the chalice with the bread and what we call wine and bread during the ordination ceremony, they were using in a Latin church. But in the East Syrian ceremony, they were not using, only the chalice was given. And so Ros had, according to Ros, what was essential in the ceremony, in the rite, was the laying of hands. He was very sure about it. That's why he's writing to Rome. Please reply to us. What is the essential dimension, essential character of the rite of ordination? So he is asking that a theological discussion should be called on here and decide, please, because we are in confusion. This is a change that happened in Ros, because Ros was even ready to accept a different ritual ceremony of East Syrian ordination rite without, for him, what was most important, the crucial thing was the laying on of. And now we know that is the basic, what we call, the essence of the ordination ceremony is the laying on of hands. Now, Ros is right, because he was thinking a little ahead of time. It took 3 more centuries. In 1956 only, the Rome decided what is the essence of the ordination script. So we are in a process. They said 3-4 centuries back, now we decide that they were right. Mar Abraham was also right. Mar Abraham said, what is important is faith and baptism, not the culture, not the customs. We use Siri, what's the problem? Thank you. I think we are
Shall we?
exceeding the time. Okay, we can finish.
Okay.
The laying on of hands, that was exactly the same discussion we had with the Mennonites.
Okay.
No, we
aren't
can
you going?
finish.
So, I ask Father Jellico to bless us before we leave.
So as we arrive to the end, I would like to make some publicity, if in the name of Georgias, if they permit to me. If I made something wrong, I think that Professor Kiraz is still online. If I made something wrong, you can correct me. So Georgias gave for this famous book discount about 30%. And this discount is valid until April 8. So I would just like to say to you some instruction for these discount procedures. So you should to go on the internet and to find the website of Georgias Press. And once when you arrive to this web page, so you will go to the search, and then you will make inscription the syrorum orientalium erroribus. So the title of the book, and you will immediately see the book. So you will just click, and it will bring you to the main page of presentation of this book, where you can buy it. So you will scroll down, and you will add to cart, and it will bring you to go to cart. So finally, you will find this discount code, and you will put here the code, secret code, Syriac India. So it's very clear, and then you just proceed with your buying process. So to say in very, very shortly, so you should to go to the Georgias Press. Then on the search you will find the syrorum orientalium erroribus. You will add to the cart, and then you will enter secret code, and then continue with your shipping. So if you will have any other problem, you can contact this email, so you will have receive certain help for this. And at the end, I would like to thank, first of all our speakers, Professor Perczel, Professor Teule, and Professor Winkler. Thank you very much that you accept to join to us and to present this book. And also thanks to the Antony that he made this work on research. So, and thank you all of you who came and sharing with us this evening. And I hope that you really profit something and you learned something, and that this meeting, it was very useful for all of us. Thank you very much.
I'm supposed to add Buonasera. Okay, no.